Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is part of the Young Scholars webinar series on climate change, macroeconomics and finance, organized by the E-Access Forum. We're very excited to have Deeksha Gupta today. She will present her research co-authored with Jan Starmans, titled Dynamic Green Disclosure Requirements. And it studies the optimal design of green disclosure requirements to support a firm's transition to greener technologies. Deeksha Gupta is an assistant professor of finance at the Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins. Prior to this, she was at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University. She also serves as an associate editor at the Review of Finance, and her main research interests lie in socially responsible investing, digital currencies, housing markets, and financial fragility. Deeksha, we're very excited to have you. The floor is yours. You have 40 minutes, and regarding the format, so we allow for clarifying questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat. If it's a clarifying question, that would be very helpful. And then at the end, we will also have some time for Q&A. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming. And we're very excited to hear about the dynamic green disclosure requirements.
Great, thanks a lot, Diego, for the introduction and for inviting me to present this paper. It's joint work with Jan Starmans, who is at the Stockholm School of Economics. Well, green disclosure requirements are emerging as a potentially important new policy tool, which regulators are hoping can help enable a green transition. So one prominent initiative is the EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the SFDR, according to which its investment funds need to disclose their greenness and sustainability to investors. The EU stated policy goals with the SFDR are to assist sustainable investors in making informed decisions, and hopefully through this more informed decision-making process, help facilitate the economy's green transition. So in this paper, we are interested in studying the question of how regulators should design green disclosure requirements. So to study this question, we develop a model of green disclosure. In it, we have socially responsible investors who value firms' greenness. And we assume that greenness, or how green a company is not observable without green disclosure requirements. So there's going to be room in the model for regulation to help inform investors about how green firms are and help them with more informed decision-making. We're interested in jointly studying green disclosure requirements and the characteristics of the underlying transition technology. So a key innovation in the model is that we are going to think about firms' green transition as a multi-step process. So it's not a one-step process in the sense where firms pay a reform cost and they go from being, say, a high emitter firm to a low emitter firm. Rather, we're going to think about green transition as involving two steps. So in the first step, a firm can adopt a green technology. And in the second step, they can scale this technology. So when we're thinking about this first step of adoption, think about the initial steps that a firm might have to take if it wants to become greener. Right? So that might mean that the firm has to employ workers who can help the firm become more sustainable and specialize in working with greener technologies. Maybe the firm is going to take R&D. It may try to find greener suppliers. There might be CapEx expenditures involved with buying green, less polluting assets. It might have to retire dirty, really polluting assets. It might decide to try to implement sustainable practices within specific product categories. So when we think about adoption, we're really thinking about the initial steps that a firm has to take to try to become greener. And scaling is really taking these steps and deploying them at scale. So you might think that once a firm has undertaken this initial investment or has been able to adopt greener practices, it might want to deploy these practices across all products and throughout its supply chain. So in the model, we're going to depict this by having 3 types of firms. We're going to call them dirty, low type green, and high type green firms. So a dirty firm can adopt the green technology to become a low type green firm, so that makes it greener. And then it can decide to scale the green technology and become a high type green firm. And what we were interested in capturing through this process is the idea that if we're thinking about firms that are trying to become greener, trying to cut down on their emissions, the early steps of that transition process might be particularly expensive for firms. And if they're really expensive, they could create bottlenecks in this green transition process. So imagine like the capital expenditure required to purchase new, cleaner assets, and the cost of potentially retiring dirty, polluting assets. So those steps could be particularly expensive. And if that's the case, they would create bottlenecks in the green transition process. And as I'm going to show you, the characteristics of the underlying transition is they're going to be first order when it comes to what green disclosure requirements are optimal in our model. And we're breaking here a really typical assumption we make in economics about technologies like production technologies, or in this case, the green transition technology, having concave benefits and convex costs. Because in that case, if you think about like earlier steps when firms are at lower scale, the benefits are relatively high and the costs are relatively low. So you wouldn't get these types of bottlenecks that we want to think about. So we show that limited transparency is not really telling investors about how green firms are, obfuscating that a little bit, can actually generate better incentives for adoption, the first step in the green transition process, than full transparency. So what do I mean when I say limited transparency? I'll explain this in more detail when we get to the model. We call it lax green disclosure. And it essentially discloses firm types, but instead of telling investors whether a firm is low type green or high type green separately, it's going to pool them in a single green category. So it's essentially creating a less granular disclosure category. So we show that that can generate better incentives for adoption, the first step in the green transition process, but it kills any incentives to scale, which is to undertake the second step in the green transition process. And the reason it's going to generate better incentives for adoption is it essentially creates a misvaluation subsidy. So low type green firms end up being pooled with high type green firms, and that's the valuation you get if you're categorized as a green firm. So a dirty firm knows that if they adopt the green technology, instead of they're going to get this pooled valuation, which includes not just low type green firms, but also high type green firms. So an interesting insight that comes out of this is that some amount of obfuscation, so not giving investors very precise information about how green firms are, is actually consistent with firm reform. We call this mandated greenwashing in the paper, and it's in contrast to other research that often interprets greenwashing as evidence of firms not reforming. So in our setting, some amount of obfuscation, so letting these low type green firms get slightly higher valuations because they're pooled with firms that could be greener, is actually consistent with firm reform and can even generate incentives for it. So we also show that dynamic green disclosure, so having requirements where transparency increases over time, can generate better incentives for both adoption and scaling than having full transparency forever. So both steps of the green transition process, adoption and scaling, we can generate better incentives for them if we increase transparency slowly. And when the regulator is deciding whether to choose a regime which has dynamic requirements versus just having full transparency throughout, they can face a trade-off between the speed of green transition and the breadth of green transition. So in the model, what dynamic green disclosure requirements will allow is it will allow us to achieve greater breadth of green transition. So overall, the number of firms that become greener can be higher under dynamic green disclosure, but it might come at the cost of reducing the speed of green transition. So there'll be a subset of firms that end up transitioning slower than they would under full transparency. And this idea that we increase transparency slowly over time is a feature that's shared by many green disclosure requirements. So in the EU, the SFDR, which I mentioned, pertains to funds, investment funds, the CSRD, which is pertains to firms, and then the SEC in the US, California climate disclosure rules, the UK climate disclosure rules all have this feature where they are going to become, green disclosure becomes more granular and stricter over time. And one of the things that we think is quite interesting is that the stringency of the requirements is going to interact over time. So the expectation that green disclosure requirements are going to become stricter and more granular actually can make the period where we have more lax requirements more effective in getting firms to adopt the green technology. And so the sort of idea that we're going to move to stricter requirements actually helps the lax period be more effective. And so the SFDR, which I mentioned, was the Green Disclosure Regulation on investment funds in the EU. They have two levels, level 1 and level 2. So level 1 is the first level, which is less strict. And then we move to level 2, which becomes more strict. So there's some research that's studying the SFDR level 1 now, and they're finding that that was in fact effective when it comes to getting funds to become greener. So one of the implications about our analysis would be that it matters that there's an expectation that we're going to move to level 2. So if we just took SFDR level 1 and tried to recreate that without having the, without moving to level 2 in the future, you may not get something that's as effective as if you have level 1 and there's an expectation that you're going to move to level 2. So this work is part of a broader research agenda where we've been interested in thinking about the effect that socially responsible investors can have on the pace of firm reform. So in another paper, which was also co-authored with Jan, we're thinking about impact investing and the sort of investment strategies and mandates and how they affect how quickly firms are going to reform. So here we're interested in similar questions, but we're studying green disclosure requirements and this trade-off between, we find this trade-off between the pace and the breadth of green transition. There's also a small group of papers that are thinking about the optimal design of green disclosure requirements. We're thinking about this in a dynamic model, think about dynamic green disclosure requirements, and we're thinking about a multi-step transition technology. And we also have an empirical literature studying green disclosure. Okay. Diego, did you want me to answer any questions before I jump into the model?
I think it will make more sense if you have a bit more detail on the modeling. This was a great introduction so far.
Great. Okay, so let's jump into the model. So we have an infinite horizon where agents have a common time discount factor beta. There's a unit continuum of firms. Each firm is going to generate a random profit at the end of each period and is operated by a different manager. So the firms, besides generating profits, they're also going to generate a social benefit in every period. And as I mentioned, we have 3 types of firms. So dirty firms, low type green firms, and high type green firms. Mu here represents the initial masses of each type of firm. And we assume that dirty firms generate the lowest social benefit and high type green firms generate the highest social benefit.
Deeksha, can I clarify a question now? So we assume that all firms have the same distribution because there is a big literature that studies, say, the greenium or the fact that actually returns between green and brown may be different. So how do you think about that?
So in the baseline model, we assume that all firms generate the same profit, and we basically shut down any learning from profits. So if you had, let's say, high type green firms, generate significantly lower profit than low type green firms, investors may be able to, figure out, like, so even if we have, let's say, lax green disclosure, investors may be able to learn about what firms are high type green versus low type green from looking at their profits. We do an extension in which we allow firms to have like a certain fraction of firms, their type is revealed by an exogenous signal. So you can think about that a little bit, sort of that, well, if firms are generating, like if one type of firm generates lower profits, that might allow investors to learn about their types. And I can, like, maybe once we go over the model, I can talk to you about how that changes things. But in the baseline model, we assume there's no learning from profits, and it's yeah, definitely if there is learning from profits, it essentially makes lax green disclosure. It can make that harder to sustain. Okay, so we're gonna represent, I'm gonna use delta A. So this is essentially the increase in the social benefit from adoption. So that's just gonna be the social benefit that a low type green firm generates minus the social benefit that a dirty firm generates. And delta S here is gonna be the increase in the social benefit from scaling. So the social benefit that a high type green firm generates minus the social benefit that a low type green firm generates. And so, as I mentioned, we have this two-step green transition technology. So a dirty firm can choose to adopt the green technology at a cost kappa A, and that's going to transition it from being a dirty firm to a low-type green firm. And then a low-type green firm can choose to scale the green technology by paying a cost kappa S, which is going to transition it from being a low-type green firm to a high-type green firm. We're going to assume that both adoption and scaling are socially desirable. And Diego, this goes a little bit to the question that you asked. In the baseline model, we assume that the investors can't learn about whether firms have paid an adoption or scaling cost from looking at the realized profits. So essentially assuming that profits are noisy enough that investors really can't learn about a firm type unless they have unless there are green disclosure requirements in place that tell them the firm type. So there's a risk-neutral representative investor who's endowed with each firm's shares, and we're going to assume that the investor cannot observe firms' types without green disclosure requirements. So the expected per period utility of the investor under full information, so they value firm profits, but they also internalize a fraction lambda of the social benefit that the firm generates. So this is a pro-social investor who cares about the benefits that the firm is generating. And we have firm managers. They can't convey firm type to investors without green disclosure requirements. They're going to maximize investors' expected end-of-period valuations. And there's a regulator who's going to set initial green disclosure requirements at the beginning of time zero. The regulator, when we think about dynamic green disclosure requirements, we're going to allow the regulator with some probability rho to change green disclosure requirements and make them stricter at the beginning of every subsequent period. And the regulator is going to maximize the expected discounted aggregate social surplus. I'm going to think about 3 different types of green disclosure requirements. To start, we'll think about just static green disclosure, so time invariant requirements. What if we just had full transparency forever, or if we had limited transparency forever? And in the case of full transparency, firm types are going to be revealed at the end of each period. So at the end of each period, we disclose whether a firm is dirty, low type green, or high type green. In the case of limited transparency, the green category is going to be less granular. So low and high type green firms will be pooled into a single green category. And then we're going to think about dynamic green disclosure requirements where we start with less transparency and increase to full transparency. So in that case, initially disclosure requirements will be lax. And then with some probability, the regulator will be able to switch them to being strict in subsequent periods. So this is just a visual.
Can I ask one thing,
Yeah.
Deeksha? Could you also perceive like a policy where basically you just get a signal of the high type so that you don't know it with 100% in the strict case, but basically it's somewhere like in between these two, right? That you basically with a probability then can infer, because I guess you will get some information through like this disclosure, but it's sometimes maybe also hard to really know like whether how strict it is. So that's why I was thinking maybe it could make sense that the investor could assign sort of a probability, whether it's like a high or low.
Yeah, we haven't worked through that case. So the case that we have worked through is, what if there's just this like a fully revealing signal with some probability about firms' types, and the regulator has no control over that. But I think qualitatively the results should remain similar. And I'm trying to think if the results would be exactly the same as in that case that we studied. Which I'll have to think a little bit more about if anything changes, but I think we can absolutely do that, and qualitatively our results should remain the same. But as I'll show you once we get there, so the like lax disclosure essentially helps us with the first step in the process, so with adoption, and strict disclosure helps us get the second step in the process, scaling. So if the signal was not completely revealing about a firm's type, I think what you would have is you would essentially have it might mean that the strict disclosure part doesn't work as well as it would in the model. So I think that's where we'll see a qualitative, that's where we'll see maybe a quantitative difference, but qualitatively, I think it should be the same. But that's something we need to work through. Okay, so here's just the timeline of the model. So at the beginning of time, the regulator will set initial green disclosure requirements. And based on these requirements, managers will decide whether they want to adopt the green technology or scale the green technology. Then firm profits are going to realize, and firm types are revealed in accordance with the green disclosure requirements. So then when we think about dynamic requirements in every subsequent period with some probability, the regulator will be able to set new disclosure requirements. Again, managers can decide whether to adopt or scale the green technology, and firm profits are realized and their types will be revealed in accordance with the disclosure requirements. So that's the model. Let me walk you through the results. So let's start by first thinking about, well, what if we just had strict green disclosure requirements forever? So we just have full transparency. We tell the investor exactly what the firm type is at the end of every single period. Okay. So let's first think about the manager of a low type green firm. Now they're trying to decide if they want to scale the green technology and become a high type green firm. So what is this manager going to do? Well, they're going to think about whether the increase in the investor's valuation, if they were to scale the green technology, they're going to compare that to the cost of scaling. Now, if the increase in valuation is higher than the cost of scaling, they're going to go ahead and scale the green technology. Now, what about the manager of a dirty firm? The manager of a dirty firm is going to have an additional consideration. So they're trying to decide, do I want to adopt the green technology and go from being a dirty firm to a low type green firm? So they're also going to think, okay, well, if I go from being a dirty firm to a low type green firm, there's going to be an increase in the valuation of the firm. But in addition, once they become a low type green firm, they have the option of scaling the green technology. So essentially, it's like a follow-on investment option. So if they scale the if they adopt the green technology, they may want to scale it in the future. And the idea is that if this option value of scaling the green technology is high enough, that might cause them that can drive adoption, right? Because even if this first part is quite low, the option value of scaling might be high enough that you would be willing to pay the adoption cost.
Deeksha, can I ask a clarifying question? Maybe I missed this. So can you explain again, given that like profits, they don't change with respect to these choices, like how does like scaling or adoption exactly affect evaluation? So how does that work?
Yeah. Okay, let me go back a little bit. So that's coming from here. The investors' preferences, basically. So this is the per period utility of the investor. So the investor cares about profits, and because our expected profits are the same, that's just doesn't really matter whether you're dirty, low type green, or high type green. That part of the investor's valuation of the firm is the same. But then the investor is going to internalize the fraction lambda of the firm's benefits. So that's where it's coming from. That, you know,
But so do you need this, or could you alternatively also have like a setting where basically the profits will be affected by these choices, so it works through profits without having, say, investors that care about the environment, or then basically would be different implications?
I think so. You could, if you have, as long as profits were in, I'm trying to think.
We can also discuss it later. I don't want to derail you.
I don't want to give you the wrong answer. So my gut reaction was yes. That should work as long as profits are still noisy enough. What you do need is you need to preserve the ranking. That's important. So you need high type green firms in that case to generate more profits than low type green firms, than dirty firms. But I would have to think about learning from profits. What you can do, and we talk about this interpretation in the paper, is there is a physical risk interpretation. So we can imagine this piece being a risk premium for physical risk. So if going from being a dirty to a low type green firm to a high type green firm, if that decreases physical risk, then the risk premium the investor needs to hold the firm would decrease. So that interpretation does work. What is important is that the ranking is preserved. So the value of a high type green firm, so an investor values a high type green firm more than a low type green firm, more than a dirty firm. That's important.
So why just physical risk? Like, couldn't it also work with transition risk, or like what's the?
It can work with transition risk. The reason we tried to stay away from that interpretation is we can think about the transition risk as a choice of the regulator. So you may also want to think about like, well, you know, what if the regulator could jointly influence green disclosure requirements and transition risk? That's why we went for the physical risk interpretation, but you can think about it as transition risk as well. Did that answer your question, Diego?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the manager is going to adopt the green technology if you know, just the kind of the increase in firm value from going from a dirty to a low type green firm, if that plus this option value of scaling is higher than the adoption cost. So here I just have that idea visually represented for you. So on the x-axis, we have the adoption cost. And on the y-axis, we have the scaling cost. And so this rectangular region here, this is for low values of the adoption cost. So this is basically where the adoption cost is low enough that the valuation gain from just going from dirty to low type green exceeds the adoption cost. So it's really when this first piece is higher than kappa A. So in this region, there's going to be adoption even if firms didn't scale after. And then what this triangular region is capturing is it's showing you when dirty firms have an incentive to adopt, and that is really being driven by the option value of scaling. So in this region, adoption by itself is not valuable for the firm. So a dirty firm would not want to simply adopt the green technology and just stay as a low type green firm, but it's really the fact that it knows once it adopts the green technology, it can also scale and then get an even higher valuation that's driving the firm's adoption decisions. And the yellow color here is capturing This is where dirty firms both adopt and scale the green technology because the scaling cost is relatively low. And this blue region here captures the area where they adopt the green technology because adoption costs are low, but scaling costs are too high, so they don't scale. Okay. So this triangular region is really where the option value of scaling is driving the adoption decision. So now let's think about, well, what if we had limited transparency forever? So time invariant, lax green disclosure requirements. Now, in this case, if we think about it, low-type green firms will never want to scale the green technology, right? Because what's happening is low-type green firms, they're in this pooled green category now with high-type green firms. So the valuation of a low-type green firm and a high-type green firm are the same. But a low-type green firm, so if they scale the green technology, they wouldn't get any gain in valuation because all green firms, so low-type and high-type green firms, are valued the same way, but they have to pay a scaling cost. So a low-type green firm will never want to scale the green technology. And what that's also going to mean is when a dirty firm is thinking about adopting the green technology, there's no longer going to be any option value of scaling, right? There's no scaling happening. Your scaling would mean you're paying a cost, not getting a valuation increase. So the option value of scaling, that's going to go away when it comes to incentives for adoption. So what is the valuation going to be of a firm which is in this pooled green category? Well, that's going to be a weighted average of the value, investors place on a low-type green firm and a high-type green firm. And those weights are going to be the relative proportions of high-type green and low-type green firms in each category. That's going to depend on their initial masses, but also the fraction of dirty firms that become low-type green, that decide to adopt the green technology because they're going to get into this green category. So phi here represents the fraction of dirty firms that adopt the green technology. And what you will notice is, well, what does a higher phi do? A higher phi essentially means that we're putting a higher weight on the proportion of low-type green firms in this pooled green category. It's actually going to bring the valuation down. So what happens in this pooled green category? Well, low-type green firms, they're being pooled with high-type green firms, which investors value more. So they're going to be overvalued relative to the full transparency case. And high-type green firms are being pooled with low-type green firms. So they're getting undervalued relative to the full transparency case. And so the idea is that for a dirty firm, if it adopts the green technology, now it's in this pooled green category. So it's getting this pooled valuation, whereas under strict disclosure, it was only going to be valued like a low-type green firm. So there's essentially what we call a misvaluation subsidy now for low-type green firms, and that can drive adoption. And another thing that I was talking about, how the fraction of dirty firms that adopt the green technology affect this pooled valuation, that essentially implies that adoption decisions between dirty firms are going to be strategic substitutes. So the more dirty firms that adopt the green technology, the lower is this misvaluation subsidy because it decreases the valuation of this pooled green category. And that decreases adoption incentives because it decreases the valuation gain a firm is going to get from adopting the green technology. So we can think again about the adoption and scaling decisions by dirty firms under lax green disclosure. So the first thing to notice is there's no scaling anymore, right? So we were representing scaling, to show you here, with this, so the yellow color here represented scaling decisions. There's no more scaling under lax green disclosure. So if you had lax green disclosure forever. So we don't get scaling anymore, but we may get more adoption. So the solid black line, that represented, I guess, beyond that, the solid black line under full disclosure, we weren't getting any adoption or any scaling. What happens under lax green disclosure? Well, adoption alone becomes, if a dirty firm is adopting the green technology and then just staying a low-type green firm, never scaling, that becomes more attractive because it's getting this pooled valuation rather than being valued as a low-type green firm. and that can increase adoption incentives. So lax green disclosure, it can essentially generate stronger incentives for adoption alone, just to, at least undertake that first step and then stay at low type green, than full disclosure, but it's going to prevent scaling. So when would a regulator potentially prefer between these two, like, time invariant disclosure requirements? When would they prefer lax? Well, they would prefer lax if we were kind of in this region here with the horizontal lines, because under lax here, I'm getting some adoption by dirty firms, but and I wasn't getting any adoption earlier, right? So lax is going to generate better incentives for dirty firms to adopt the green technology than strict disclosure here. So the benefit of lax disclosure is going to be that we can get some adoption by dirty firms. There's also a potential cost of lax disclosure. Now, there might have been some initially low type green firms who would have scaled the green technology under full disclosure. They're no longer going to scale the green technology under lax disclosure. So this line here actually represents when scaling costs are low enough that a low type green firm would want to scale. So if we're in, if costs are in this, if scaling costs are in this region, lax disclosure generates adoption, but it kills scaling. But under full disclosure, at least those initially low type green firms would have been scaling. Okay, so for a regulator, if they're just deciding between these time invariant disclosure requirements, they're going to prefer having laxer disclosure to stricter disclosure if the value of increased adoption is higher than any possible social loss from less scaling by low type green firms. So an implication here of the analysis so far is obfuscating greenness can help address bottlenecks in the green transition process. So it can help incentivize this first step adoption in the green transition process. So we think about this obfuscation, we call it mandated greenwashing in the paper. And so this can actually be consistent with firm reform. It's not necessarily inconsistent with the idea that firms are improving themselves.
There is a question, Meha. Do you mind taking it now, or?
No, now it's perfect.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly check if I missed this. What is it that makes investors invest in a dirty firm after period 1? Like, is there a friction that makes them continue to want to hold the green firm? I mean, the dirty firm?
So I think it's more that prices are going to adjust so that investors are still willing to invest in dirty firms. Let me go back here. Okay. So if you think about what is going to happen if I know that a firm is dirty as an investor, what am I willing to pay for it? I'm willing to pay firm profits. And then so BI, that we call it the social benefit, it could be negative though. So it could be a social cost. So the idea is that, I'm going to adjust the price that I'm willing to pay for this firm. So I'm going to pay for profits. If I know you're dirty, I'm either, this is, if the benefit is the social benefit is still positive, I'll pay a little bit more than profits, but not as much as I'm paying for a green firm. And if it's a social cost, I'm actually paying you less than the profits you generate. So investors are still going to hold all 3 types of firms, but the prices that they're going to pay for them, if they know that the firm is definitely dirty, will be lower than the price they'll pay for like a green firm. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So let's move on now to thinking about dynamic disclosure requirements. So when we were thinking about, well, what if we had strict disclosure requirements forever, and what was incentivizing dirty firms to adopt the green technology? We had this option value of scaling, right? And that was that could help incentivize adoption, because the firm knew, well, if I adopt the green technology, I'll become low type green, then I can choose to scale and I can become even greener. Now, we lost that option value under when we were thinking about time invariant lax disclosure, but we had a misvaluation subsidy that could help adoption. So strict versus lax, they were generating different incentives for adopting the green technology. So now, what if the regulator were to start with lax disclosure and then they switch to strict with some probability in future periods? In that case, when we have that initial period of lax requirements, we can think about what the valuation of a firm in this pooled green category will look like. So in this case, that valuation, it's gonna, so initially, like during the period of lax disclosure, low type green firms and high type green firms, they're being pulled together into a single category. So there is going to be a misvaluation subsidy. That's what's captured by this first part. But in addition, investors are going to think, well, I know in the future there's going to be a switch to strict. And when that switch happens, there's going to be full disclosure. So you can now I'll be able to distinguish between low type green and high type green firms. And that is going to potentially still generate incentives for scaling. So you now kind of get both these components, right? So you have a misvaluation subsidy during the period of lax disclosure because low type and high type green firms are pulled together. So you get that subsidy. But the expectation that we're going to switch to strict requirements in the future, if scaling happens once the switch occurs, investors are going to account for that when they value firms, that in the future, once requirements switch to being strict, these firms that they're investing in will also scale.
Deeksha, can I ask a question about, I think you said it, but I was just wanted to clarify. So the switch and the timing of it is known to both investors and firms. Is that correct?
So we assume that with probability rho, the regulator can, like each period with probability rho, the regulator will be able to switch. And we show in the paper that the regulator always wants to switch if they have that possibility. So this is essentially the expected, the expected value of scaling. So the investors aren't sure when it's going to happen, but each period with probability rho, the switch is going to happen.
And one related question on the firm. So once you adopt it and say you're now a low type green, is there a way to go back and unadopt and become brown again? Or like you prevent that in the model?
We prevent that in the model. So you can't go back. I
was just wondering whether that could basically...
If you become low type green, you're not going to want to go back. But I'm thinking, we start with these initial masses of low type and high type green firms. So it is, we are assuming that they don't want to become less green. But what were you were going to say something, Diego?
Yeah, no, I just thought maybe in this dynamic, but maybe it's not the case if only in probability, but I was wondering whether there could be a strategy that is optimal that basically, okay, you adopt once you have this subsidy, right, this misvaluation subsidy, but then basically when the more strict disclosure requirements hit, then you basically can go back and...
I think that would be possible. Like, I think there, if the technology was reversible, then once you move to strict, you would want to go back. But what would happen then, is the regulator wouldn't want to switch to strict if that happens. So the regulator would just choose, like, let's say low type, what's going to happen if I switch to strict is just that these low type green firms will start becoming dirty. And that's like what happens once I get to strict. I just don't want to switch. So we don't consider that case. But I think then you would find that having lax requirements forever could be better than having dynamic green disclosure requirements. Right now, the way we set up the model, it's always better to have dynamic green disclosure requirements. But if firms ended up wanting to revert back, you just wouldn't want to move to a stricter regime. Yeah. Okay, So what happens, so the basic idea is under dynamic green disclosure requirements, we kind of we can preserve both. We can have a misvaluation subsidy, and we also can get, can drive adoption through having this future option value of scaling once requirements switch to strict. So here we have our figure again, and what you see is that under dynamic requirements, you can get both more adoption and more scaling than you would under under full disclosures, under strict disclosure forever. So if we now think about the regulator's choice of dynamic green disclosure requirements versus strict green disclosure requirements, what are the benefits of having this dynamic policy? You can get increased adoption and scaling by dirty firms. But there's still going to be a cost of dynamic disclosure requirements relative to strict disclosure requirements. There are these initially low type green firms who would scale the green technology under full disclosure. So once you have strict green disclosure requirements, these firms will scale the green technology. Under dynamic requirements, they're going to wait until the switch happens to strict before they scale. So you can get more increased adoption and scaling by dirty firms, but there's still a cost because you're going to slow down the scaling of initially low type green firms. So they're just going to wait until the requirements become strict before they actually scale. So the regulator, when deciding whether or not they want dynamic green disclosure requirements, they're going to face a trade-off between the breadth versus the pace of green transition. So what I can do is if I have dynamic green disclosure requirements, I'm getting more dirty firms to adopt. I'm getting more dirty firms to scale the green technology. So I can really have a greater breadth of green transition. I'm getting a lot more firms to become greener, but I might be slowing down the pace of green transition for these initially low type green firms. So I have this trade-off between the breadth and the pace of green transition. And these requirements are going to interact over time in a way that we think is quite interesting. So you actually get stronger. The fact that we're going to move from lax green disclosure requirements to strict green disclosure requirements actually generates stronger adoption incentives than if we had just lax green disclosure requirements forever, because we managed to preserve this option value of scaling. And so having the expectation of strict green disclosure requirements in the future actually increases the effectiveness of lax green disclosure. And similarly, actually having this period of lax green disclosure before we move to strict, that's going to increase the number of firms that decide to adopt the green technology, and that'll eventually scale. So it increases the breadth of green transition and can increase the effectiveness of strict green disclosure in terms of, in the extensive margin, how many firms we're getting to scale once we get to strict green disclosure. And so one of the interesting insights, and what we hope will be helpful as we start doing research on the effectiveness of these different disclosure requirements that we're seeing being put in place, is that expectations about future requirements can affect current investments in green technology. So it's not just about the current requirements that are in place, but also how we think those requirements will evolve in the future. Okay, so I wanted to leave some time for questions. Maybe I'll skip this piece. Diego, because you asked a question, I'll quickly just touch on some extensions that we do. So in one case, we allow firms to voluntarily disclose their types. So we endow a fraction of firms with a voluntary disclosure technology. And we also consider an extension where there's a fully revealing signal about the firm's types and the firm's type. And that's the idea is that investors might be able to learn from firms' profit realizations. And so generally more transparency. So, voluntary disclosure, let's say some high type green firms start disclosing their types. That's going to reduce adoption incentives during the lax period. However, there is a benefit because some low type green firms might want to scale now quickly. So if a low type green firm knows that it can scale and then reveal to everyone, let's say that's a high type green firm, then it can actually, it doesn't need to wait until disclosure requirements switch to strict before scaling. So depending on which effect dominates, because you essentially, it's the same breadth versus pace trade-off. You can get less breadth because you're reducing adoption incentives for the green transition, but you can get a slightly better pace for some firms. So depending on which effect dominates, it can increase or decrease the relative benefits of dynamic green disclosure. So it just depends on whether the regulator likes the fact that now under, let's say, voluntary disclosure or revealing signals about firms' types, yes, they get a little less breadth, but things are going a little faster under dynamic green disclosure. So it just depends on whether the regulator likes that or not. Okay, so I'll just conclude with that. I think it's really important to understand the role green disclosure requirements can play in facilitating green transition. And in this paper, we hope to illustrate that the design of these requirements is going to be inherently linked to the transition technology. And if the transition process features bottlenecks, if those early steps of the green transition process are particularly expensive, then dynamic green disclosure requirements where we become more transparent over time may be most effective in promoting green transition. So thank you.
Excellent. This was really awesome, Deeksha. Just wanted to ask the participants whether you have any questions. I don't see anything right now in the Q&A, but if you have, please, oh, there is a hand raised. So Isabella, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Deeksha. Very interesting, very insightful presentation. So I was wondering, and this relates to some of the questions that I think were also raised during the presentation, because you have a representative investor, and you went through it, right? That this investor or these investors, they care about profits and the social benefit. I was just wondering, and I appreciate that, you know, it's already complicated enough, but if I think of real life, obviously that investors which care more about the social benefits, there are investors who only care about profits, or at least to a greater extent. And my intuition would be that if you have some heterogeneity in these investors and if the distribution of these investors are different, that this obviously will also affect the valuation, which in turn could affect how firms are incentivized to scale or to adopt in the first place. I don't know if you have it in your paper, but I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that and how you think this would potentially change the implications in terms of, okay, maybe the incentive to disclose is going to be less if you know that there's a group of investors which doesn't really care about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. So it's not something that we are doing in the paper as of now, because kind of the main point that you brought up, that it would make the analysis very complicated. I don't want to say it'll make it intractable because we haven't tried it. So I think the main thing that we need, right, is that there's some so we have managers who care. We have two assumptions that are important, right? We have managers who care about investors' valuation of the firm, so they're trying to maximize the value of the firm. And then we have these, this representative investor, and kind of what happens is that like greener firms command a higher valuation than dirty firms. So I think we can imagine having heterogeneous investors. What's important is, well, what does that mean about like the prices that firms are actually going to start trading at in equilibrium? So if that means that the greenium is killed, right? Or it's like, if that means that, more green firms are not going to command higher prices anymore, then essentially there's going to be like no benefit of green disclosure requirements in the model. If that means, if it's more of a qualitative effect, so if it means like, yes, you have some dirty investors, so they're willing to pay for dirty firms, they're willing to pay relatively high prices for dirty firms, and they're the ones who are really setting the marginal prices. But you do have some, there's still like some investors who are paying high prices for greener firms, it might reduce like it would reduce the effect qualitatively, but it shouldn't, so it would reduce the effect quantitatively, but qualitatively things should still hold. I don't think that's like a, kind of, it's not a very like, what's the word I'm looking for? I think it's not a really like fulfilling, I think there's a better word out there, answer to your question, because it definitely is going to make it complicated depending on how you decide to model these investors. But that's kind of what we need. We need there to be like, we need the market to reward green firms in some ways, and for managers to care about it. But you could imagine that the reward is less, but some managers have green preferences personally, and that can like further incentivize them to become greener. But all these things, but that's kind of the two things you need, is that managers are responding to, they want to make firms greener, and they're responding to the information that investors have, because that's really what green disclosure requirements are doing. They're allowing investors to respond to information and affect firm valuations in a way that the manager is responding to. So that's kind of what you need.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? If not, I can also ask one more that I was wondering, because I really found this very interesting. So this positive notion of, say, greenwashing that you have in the model, but then in practice, oftentimes what you worry about is that basically firms claim to be green, but they're not truthful about it. So whereas in your setting, I mean, if you disclose, I mean, that's a fact, and you're green or not, right? So there is not the possibility that you basically can say in your disclosure that you are green, but in fact you haven't adopted, right? So that's so I was just wondering how you think about that. I mean, I guess, yeah, if the disclosure is enforced with high enough fines, I guess that's an equilibrium you could end in. But yeah, I was just wondering whether.
Yeah. And so it's definitely a distinct notion, I would say. So, because I think the literature, when we think about greenwashing, we're often thinking about firms actively like manipulating investors. And we don't have that in the model, right? Like investors so we don't have, like, firms are not trying to do anything to represent themselves as a firm that is greener than the disclosure category they end up in. So it is definitely like a distinct notion. That's why we try to call it government mandated greenwashing. But the basic idea, and where I think it does apply to kind of greenwashing discussions that we have, is for firms, the idea is for a firm to be able to, like, if what greenwashing is doing is giving firms a higher, like, a unfairly high valuation, or a higher valuation than is truly representative of what the firm would get if investors had better information, then if there's some steps that the firm needs to take to still be able to start greenwashing, to be able to get that valuation, that could mean that greenwashing is incentivizing those steps. So you might think that, like, it's potentially quite easy for us to tell, say, if an auto manufacturer is making, like, gas guzzling cars, it's easy for investors to be able to say, okay, that's probably a dirty firm. What becomes really tricky is to maybe try to understand, if an auto manufacturer is making electric vehicles, how clean, kind of how they're actually sourcing, like, their batteries, like how clean they actually are, things like that. So the idea where I think it would apply, and we haven't, like, formally written this down, I think the intuition goes through, is if there's greenwashing in that second part, but that means, like, to be able to get that greenwashing, be able to do that greenwashing and get that valuation, the firm still needs to improve a little bit. It can actually generate incentives for that improvement, because once you improve, you'll be able to greenwash and get a slightly better valuation, right? But we don't have firms manipulating their types, but that's how I think you could apply the intuition.
Makes sense. Great. Yeah, no, I think we're just in time. I learned a lot. Thanks so much, Deeksha, for sharing your research with us. And thanks so much to all the participants for engaging and for your questions. I also like to advertise our next webinar, which will take place on the 10th of June, and Eric Chondo from HEC London will talk about his research on the impact of green investors on stock prices. So hope to see many of you again then, and until then, I wish you a great start into the week.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deeksha. Bye-bye.
Diego, Eva, thank you a lot for having me.
No, thank you so much. And I'll send you a little email to follow up with some other logistical questions. But thank you very much for your time. And we'll hopefully hear more from you soon.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Eva. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Diego. Bye.